the more affirmative tale has in it insights about what's happening that are really profound. And I think, one of them is first that the conventional wisdom about this period in life is wrong. It's wrong about things like creativity. And, many of you have probably read David Galensson's work about creativity in later life. I think the best take on that, there's an unpublished Malcolm Gladwell article in which he talks about the difference between these two styles of creativity, the kind of conceptual genius on the one hand that Galensson identifies, and on the other hand, kind of an experimental genius on the other hand that oftentimes blooms later in life. Gladwell tells the story about Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles. The Eagles have 3 greatest hits albums by the time they're 24, never do anything significant the rest of their life, whereas Fleetwood Mac, they're utter failures. They've gone through 7 different incarnations. They try to be a blues band unsuccessfully. They've got gray hair. Their kids are in high school. And then, three in a row, they reel off the best-selling rock albums in history to that point. And so, there is an element of these Inez Killingsworth stories that challenge that part of conventional wisdom, but I think that they attack even deeper notions that continue to prevail in policy debates. You read these articles, and there are phrases that people just skip through. Working age population. There was a foreign affairs cover story earlier this year, the coming population bomb, talks about the problem of the dependency ratio and the working age population of 15 to 59. These notions, I recently had a chance to testify in front of the Senate Finance Committee and realized that every single member of the committee was no longer part of the working age population. I mean, these things are mind-boggling, and yet policy is based on it. There's another article the New York Times Magazine excerpted the book Shock of Gray, in which it uses that lovely phrase, elder share. And I know, elders share the arts. We think of elder share as a positive thing. They don't think of that as a positive thing. So these ideas that essentially amount to scenario planning through the rearview mirror. Sort of taking the realities of past era. Not, if recent past isn't good enough, they're willing to go back, 40, 50 years to find something that's distressing, and then multiplying against the, these new demographics and pronouncing social collapse, the, pitting of young, and, So I think, when you look at these stories, first there's this idea of that, there's a paradox in assuming that this thing that we've worked so hard to achieve, longer, healthier lives, we're supposed to eat well and run around the block and lower our cholesterol so that we can live longer and ruin everything in perpetuity. That doesn't entirely make sense. But I think that the other kind of fundamental problem with a lot of these, rearview mirror planning conceptions is that they don't take account of what I think really might be the most profound change that's in front of us, which is that the whole shape of lives is shifting, and that we're inventing a new stage of life between the middle years and anything resembling true old age, at least in a 20th century conception. Suzanne Braun-Levine, one of board members, the founding editor of MIDS, she talks about 60 is the new 60. It's not the new 40 or 30 or any of those things. And I think she's absolutely right. And I think in a way, the aging society really masks something that's more like the third aging or third staging of society. And that's something that I want, because I think that's the biggest change of all. And that's something that I want to try to return to in a few minutes. But this change in the shape of lives, in the life course, in creating a life course and essentially swapping a life course that was designed for the 70 70-year existence for one that's really more fitted to a 21st century lifespan, to the 100-year possibility, is historic development. It's really once or twice a century that we make that kind of change. Everybody knows about the creation of retirement in the 50s and 60s, but even if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, adolescence was invented in 1904. G. Stanley Hall wrote a 1,000-page book, remarkable guy who founded the American Psychological Association, had the first PhD in psychology in the country. Went through a midlife crisis in the 1890s. His wife and daughter asphyxiated. He decided, he was really kind of at the end of his rope. He was going to never do anything great again, and then breaks through, publishes this book. He's 60 at the time that he invents youth, basically. So there's a lesson in that. But I think that there are. So it's really important, I think, to realize that this process of inventing stages, only happen periodically. I think the other thing that's really important is that there's nothing natural about these life stages. Some of you probably saw the New York Times Magazine article about emerging adulthood. There was a MacArthur Foundation commission, and there are a bunch of people now who are saying this period between 20 and 30, when all the kids come home and they ruin your life, it's actually a new life stage. And that article focuses a lot on whether it's truly a developmental stage, but I think most of these stages, retirement again being an example, adolescence certainly one of them, they're sociological creations. They're solutions to a problem. We were in the midst of all this urbanization, massive immigration, industrialization around the turn of the century, and people were really concerned about all these young people running wild, and adolescence was created as this moratorium period between childhood and adulthood where people could have more of an opportunity to grow up. The idea of a stage between midlife and old age itself is not a new idea, and some of you may already know this, but G. Stanley Hall himself, almost 20 years later, as he was at death's doors, I've made a huge mistake. We really should have created a stage of life between midlife and old age, which he called senescence. It's hard to imagine why that didn't catch on. If you go back and read Senescence, which was published in 1922, it's the most far-sighted book you will ever read. Often interpreted as a book about aging, and there are ways in which it's confused itself in that way, but really it's a book about this new stage of life. He talks about aging as old age as senectitude, the fifth stage. This is about this fourth stage in life, and he talks about this Indian summer and how people are outliving retirement and how the world needs more than anything else people who are capable of thinking in complex ways, who've been around the block. And he has some beautiful poetic lines about how this period when the shadows start slanting is that people sort of reach their highest powers. And so when you think about this idea of inventing stages, we have to realize that it's not unprecedented. The idea of a stage between midlife and old age itself is an old idea, and now we're seeing a flurry of new and really quite wonderful books, including Mary Catherine Bateson's new Composing a Further Life, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's The Third Chapter. These have all come out in the last couple of years. But in the end, they're social construction projects. And if we're going to have a new stage of life, we're going to actually have to invent it. We're going to have to roll up our sleeves and make it happen out of these conditions that have been forming. And when we do it, even though there's no developmental imperative around this stage, I think it's really important to think about what the assets and the opportunities are. If you read people like Mary Catherine Bateson and Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot and other wonderful thinkers about this period, Peter Laslett, the British historian who wrote A Fresh Map of Life in the 1980s, one idea is that this is a period of development, of new learning and growth. It's not just sort of the old, idea of keeping your mind active in this period, but it's really about breaking through to sort of new understanding. It's a time of important contribution where people do a lot of their most important work. There's an integrity to this period. It's distinct from other periods. But I think kind of underlying all of that is a notion about time. And I think that the heart of this period, if we're to create it and make the most of it, has to do with the intersection of three different dimensions of time. One is the one that Gary Maxworthy's story, so perfectly embodies, which is time lived, experience. That there are just certain things that you can do once you've been around the block, once you've acquired human and social capital. But I think the second and maybe even more distinctive aspect is the idea of how much time we have left to live. When we're in your 20s, the road goes on forever. You don't realize that this is a whole finite project. But when you hit your 50s, maybe it's because a parent passes away, or you get a test result that doesn't quite go the way it's supposed to. But the finiteness of life begins to dawn on us, and that has a really powerful effect on the way we make decisions and think about these things. Laura Carstensen at Stanford's done the best work, I think, on that particular question. But there's this sort of simultaneous realization that, that road might not go on forever, but it may go on for quite a bit longer. I think of that as sort of the expansion and compression of time. And then there's a sort of third dimension, which is that, the memory about how fast the last 25 years went by. So, you remember the French Revolution? There was equality, liberty, all the fraternity. This is sort of mortality, longevity, urgency. And I think that, so time left to live along with time lived, I think help to define this emerging period. And then there's the question of the time beyond our lives, because, right, you might have that extra period. It might go by fast, but it's going to go by. And all of these questions about generativity, about what happens to life beyond ourselves, how we live on, I think are also increasingly prominent in this period. So I would say time lived, time left to live, the time beyond our lives are sort of the heart of the opportunity in creating this period. Making that happen is going to require a whole new way of thinking. I mean, a new category for this period. There's lots of names and labels out there, everything from Adulthood 2 in Mary Catherine Bateson's book. Suzanne Braun Levine talks about second adulthood. Senescence is still out there for the taking if anybody wants it. Lastlet used the great third age notion. I prefer the third stage, because I think this is a stage of life, one that's on equal footing with the middle years, with true old age, with childhood. But the labels, like much of the nature of this period, are really in our hands to be shaped. And I think as we shape this period, we'll not just be creating opportunities for people in this phase of life, really, but changing all the other periods. The kind of decisions we make as young people will be different. So I think this is a project that everybody has a stake in. If we pull that off, if we concoct a new map of life that's fitted for the lifespans that we're living now, or can